Today I'm going to talk about how we can use the model view presenter, the MVP pattern, when writing Android code, and how we can test drive all the logic that we write in the presenters and keep our views as dumb as possible. Not going to concentrate much on the model part in this particular example, but stress on the fact that how the views can be dumb and presenters can be test driven. So the example that I'm looking at is a login screen in which you're asking for the username and password. So if I do not enter the username, it's going to prompt me to enter the username. Same for the password. If I enter a wrong password, it's going to show me a toast message saying that the login failed. But if the password is correct, then it's going to check against the service and take me to a new activity uh, and give the message saying the login has succeeded. Currently, the way the code has been structured uh, does not have any presenters, any unit tests, a typical activity with all the logic within the activity, which is something that I'd not encourage. So let's look at how we can clean this code up. As of now, the on login clicked is getting called as soon as the login button is clicked, and it picks the username and password from the view, checks whether they are empty, shows the message if they are, and if they are not empty, calls the login service and gets back a boolean saying that the login is successful or not. If the login is successful, simply takes the user to the new screen, else shows the login failed toast message. Uh, so before I refactor this code and introduce a presentation layer, I'd like to point out a few things. So I'm using the Android Studio version 1.2. The unit testing support has been included in this version onwards. The version before this 1.1, the support for unit testing was experimental, but 1.2 onwards, it's fully integrated. Uh, Another thing to note is that I'll be switching the build variant, the test artifact within the build variant, to be unit tests, because I want to be able to write plain JUnits to test the presenter and not use Android instrumentation for the same. Also, I'll go to the command line and I will actually introduce the test folder, which will have the same package as my source code, so that the Android Studio keeps all my unit tests under the test folder and not my source folder, my actual source/java folder. Uh, as you can see, Android Studio has recognized this. Apart from this, I will also show the libraries that I'm using to be able to unit test my code. So I'm using JUnit 4 to write my unit tests, and using Mockito, which is a pretty popular Java library for mocking uh, any Java objects that you'd not like to test. So let's get started. The first thing that I'm going to do is introduce a login presenter, which is going to take away all the logic from this particular activity and decide what to show to the user, and it'll pick the input from the input that has been entered by the user from the view as well. So let's do that. Let's introduce a login presenter. Oops, one second. Now the login presenter by itself can have the logic, but it needs to interact with the view, and also needs to interact with the service layer, the login service, so that it can make the login call and understand whether the username and password entered were correct or not. So in the constructor, let's introduce a login view. We could pass the complete activity as well, but that's generally not a good practice because the activity is capable of doing a lot more, and it's an Android activity which has its own life cycle and its own implementation. So it's better to keep an interface, something like a login view, which I'll just introduce, and have the activity implemented so that the presenter simply talks to the view interface, which has all the necessary implementation that the presenter needs. So apart from the login view, it will also need to talk to the login service so that it can actually perform the login. So first let me create this interface, which is the login view, and let's go back to the presenter and save both the view as well as the service for use later. All right, so now that our constructor is defined, let's go back to the activity and pass both the dependencies into the login presenter. Now it's complaining because the first parameter has to be a login view, and I'm passing the activity itself. So I'll have to implement the login view so that the constructor does not complain, and I'm only passing the view implementation from the login activity to the presenter. Let's save the presenter instance as soon as the onCreate is called. So now I know that within the life cycle of the activity, I will have a reference to the presenter, and I would like to delegate all the logic that I've written within the onLogin clicked method to the presenter. So as soon as the login is clicked, I'm going to call the presenter and delegate the onLogin click method to the presenter. So let's create this method. And as of now, this method does not have any code, so let's see if we can test drive all the logic that we now write in this code. So I'm going to press Command Shift T for the IDE to prompt me to create a unit test. And since I already have a test folder defined, it's going to create the test class within that. So I have the login package here and the login presenter test within it. So before I write my test, let me just get a reference to the presenter that I would like to test. So the presenter would be the login presenter, and I need two dependencies. One is the view and the other is the service that the login presenter needs to talk to. So because I'm unit testing the presenter, I don't really need real implementations of the view. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mock the view and the service. I'll just show in a second how I'll do that. I'll also keep a reference of the presenter for the tests, and since I'm going to use Mockito, I like to use Mockito's annotations to be able to instantiate the mocks. There are other ways you can go through the Mockito documentation and see at other ways you would like to instantiate the mocks, but I generally prefer this method. So I'm just going to include the annotations, and I should have everything that I need to start testing. So the first test that I'm writing should basically show an error message if the username is empty. So let's just describe that. Should show error message when username is empty. And to be able to test this, I need to set certain expectations and create the data which is required for this to work. So the first thing that I'm going to do is create an expectation that when we ask for the username from the view, so let's see, view dot get username, then return an empty string. So we are assuming that the username has not been entered and an error should be shown. So the view obviously needs to implement the username, the get username method. It will be a string in our case, and as soon as the string comes back, I'm going to call the presenter dot get login clicked, and in this case, since we want to show the error, we'll simply verify that an appropriate error is shown. Show username error, And I already have a resource string defined for the username error. So I'd expect that the view takes this resource string and displays the error appropriately. So let me just create the show username error method. It doesn't need to return anything, but it takes the resource ID for the string that needs to be displayed. Now I'll go to the implementation, which is the activity, and implement the two methods that are just defined in the interface. To be able to get the username, the view now knows how to get the username from the view. So it has a reference to the username uh, view, and it's simply going to get the string from the UI and send it to the presenter. And to show the error, uh, Android has a set error method on the views so that you can simply pass the string given the resource ID and it will show the appropriate error message. Uh, so now our first test is complete, and I'm going to run this by pressing Ctrl Shift F10 and run it as a JUnit test, not as a Gradle test, because I'm not using any of the Android functionality. Just simple JUnit tests should be sufficient for me to test this scenario. So as it says that the expected method has not been invoked on the view, so the show username error has not been invoked, which is rightly so because I've not yet implemented it. So let me go back to the implementation of the presenter and implement the code. So let me ask for the username from the view, and if the username is empty, then I should be showing an error message, which is view.show username error r.string.username underscore error. Alright, so this should be good enough for my first test. So let me run the test again and see if it passes. Now that the test is passed and I have tested the scenario of username being empty, I can go to the activity and actually remove the code which is checking the username, because I know that this other piece of code is going to take care of it within the presenter. So this is the first test that I can think of. The second one is going to be on the similar lines but for the password. So I'm going to quickly just duplicate this particular test and replace the username with password and ensure that the password is also checked. But one thing to note, uh, when I'm going to test for the password scenario, is that the username should be available, and then only I'm showing the password in this particular test. So I'm going to send the username as a non-empty string so that it doesn't fail for that scenario. But when it asks for the password, then it gets an empty string back. So it should show the password error, and I'll pass the appropriate error string here. So let's implement the required methods within the view interface. So I'm going to get the password from the view, that's the first thing, and I should be able to show the appropriate error if the password is empty. So we'll go to the implementation again of login view and implement the missing methods. So both the methods are very similar to what the username already has. So we need to get the username from the view and send it to the presenter, and similarly we are going to set the error for the password as per the resource string that is sent by the presenter. So now within this activity I can actually get rid of the password related check, and the only thing that's left after this is to be able to call the login service, which we're going to see in a moment. But before that, let me go back to my tests and complete it. So if the username error has been shown, then I don't need to proceed further and I need to return from here. But sorry about that. So I'm going to ask the view for password, and if the password is empty, then the view should display the appropriate error message for the password, and it should return as soon as it shows this error. So at this point, hopefully both of the username and password related error checking tests should pass, and we can proceed to the next scenario of checking the username and password against a service. So the next scenario is it should start the main activity when username and password are correct. So in this scenario, I'm going to return a username and password which the service thinks is the correct username and password, and then the view should take the user to the appropriate activity, whichever is the login success activity. So for that, I need to ensure that the username and password are entered. It doesn't matter what the username and password really are, because I'm going to mock the actual service call. So I'm going to say that when the login for the same set of users username and password is called, then it returns a true, which simply implies that the username and password are correct. And now when the presenters on login click method is called, then I need to verify that the view takes the user to the login success activity. So let's say that start main activity is the name of that activity. Again, this is going to be defined in the interface of the login view, and let's implement that method here. I already should be having that implementation available. So there's a activity utility that has been created which starts the activity that has to be called post successful login. So now when I run the tests, at this time the first two should proceed, but the third test that we just wrote should fail, and rightly so, because I've not yet implemented this code. So let's just go to on login clicked and ensure that we ask the service whether the username and password are correct or not. So we'll ask if the username has succeeded, and if it has, then we'll ask the view to start the main activity. And that's it. That's all that this particular test needs for it to pass. So this should pass the failing test, and the only scenario that's left now is that if the username and password are wrong, then it should show an error toast message. But still something is failing, so let me just check what I did wrong. So the view start main activity is not yet being called, so let's see where I went wrong. So I'm passing the username and password, but the start main activity is not being called. So I can actually now debug this without running the emulator and see where I'm going wrong. So let's debug the scenario. Yeah, so I actually quickly just noticed the error that I'm expecting the wrong password here, whereas here I'm expecting bond and this is band. So I will actually be able to trace this out as I go along. So if I step into the implementation, I will notice that the login succeeded is in fact false, because the username and password here are different than what the expectation I had set. So which is why the start main activity method is not being called. So this should be an easy fix. Let's go back and fix the test, and hopefully it should pass now. All right, now moving on to the last test. I should show login error when username and password are invalid. I'm going to pick some of the code from the previous test because it doesn't matter what the username and password is returned, but when the service is called, then it's going to return a false saying that whatever username and password has been entered is false. And at this point, I expect the presenter to send a command to the view saying that the login has failed and an error message needs to be shown. So we'll need to verify that the views show login error is called. Now the important thing to note here is that how the view decides what the message should look like, or in terms of how to show that particular error message, is view's responsibility. So it could be a toast message, it could be some inline messages. The presenter doesn't really care. All that the presenter cares is that this is an error scenario, and it has the string or the string resource available with it to show. So the view should just simply take that string and show the error message in whatever form that the view thinks is appropriate for the activity. So let's implement that one method that is remaining, which says that I need to show the toast message. So I should already have an implementation here, so I'll just reuse that and show the error message here. I'm going to pick the resource ID that the presenter is sending and simply show that. And at this point, I can actually get rid of most of the code that I've written within the onLogin clicked method of the activity, and let my test ensure that it's implemented. So the last test that I've written should fail because I'm not really showing the login error just yet from the presenter. So that's the missing part. So it says that the show login error has not been invoked. So let me go back to the implementation and finish that scenario. So if the code ends up here, I know that the login has not succeeded. So I can show the appropriate error message. Show login error r.string.login failed. All right. So this should pass all my tests. All right, looks good. And now my presenter has all the logic that was previously defined within the activity. And now if you look at the activity really does not have much logic. There are no conditions here. All that it is doing is it's just fulfilling the command that the presenter is asking for, as well as just returning the particular values from the view back to the presenter, and that's it. Now let's run this for the first time after the refactoring on the emulator and see if our changes were good enough. So let's deploy the latest build. So let's see if all of this works. All right, so the login is not entered. It asks me to enter the login. If the password is not entered, same error. So the login has failed even after entering the password, and if I enter the correct password, there you go. So after test driving all of my code, this is the first time that I'm running my implementation after refactoring in the emulator. And because of the confidence that I now have in my code, I know that there should not be many errors when running the app on the emulator. So this speeds up my development because I don't have to keep starting the emulator again and again to test the scenarios. It gives good code coverage for all the logic that I have written within the presenter, and gives me a test suite which defines or somehow documents the implementation that I'm doing for my presenters. So that's it, and hope you enjoyed this. Thank you.